Hey guys, Casey Roy here and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a short story read. I've done one already. I got comments of people who liked it, so this is another one. It's from the same series, The World, called The Imperial Wardens. It's a book series that I will be working on after I'm done with Sarah's Fear, the Elementals books. This story predates the first book. It's not actually a part of the books. But it gives a little background into how things get going the way they are. The story's called The Unlikely Assassin. I hope you enjoy it. Late as it was, the tavern showed no signs of slowing down. Being the largest and most popular in the city, it stayed busy. The three-story building took up an entire city block with auxiliary buildings used for storage of food, ale, and other goods. The main room made up most of the first floor with a huge fire pit in the center. A fluted chimney hung above it. Not all of the smoke made its way up the chimney, leaving the room slightly hazy. Paying customers kept the many barmaids and tavern whores hustling. They either provided a constant stream of food and drink or other services up a set of well-used stairs. Those not eating or whoring gambled. Everyone kept busy and entertained at the final rest. It was part of the reason he'd chosen to come here. Except for the occasional barmaid, he spent his night mostly alone. It only took the first two whores being turned down to get the word passed around that he didn't want entertainment. He'd sat, watched, and brooded for hours now, and yet he still hadn't come to any answers. The time to leave had long since passed. "Another drink?" The barmaid caught him off guard. When he looked up to answer, the last thing he expected was a foreigner. Her hair and features were average and unremarkable when compared to some of the other barmaids around the room. Her eyes stopped him, a vibrant ice blue that sent a jolt through him. "No." Instead of saying more, he turned his gaze back to the busy room. He didn't look at anything in particular, just watched. Noise for the eyes is how he thought of it. Perhaps an ear to listen? Her hand brushed his as she leaned slightly against the table. The hand brushed his softly, but he could feel the calluses and wear on them. This woman hadn't lived a privileged life. Why did she work here? Why the Empire? She didn't stand to make much of a living in her current profession. "No. I have what's left of this drink, and the solitude I greatly value." He held the half-full tankard up as proof. A smile spread across her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes as she leaned in closer. The angle provided him with a better view down the front of her blouse, should he choose to look. His irritation grew. He wouldn't be a mark or a victim. If she'd come from here, she'd know who he was, and to take no for the answer it was. "No!" The tankard slammed down, sloshing some of its contents across the table in his hand. The woman jerked her hand away and stepped back. His reaction and the slight buzz in his head told him he'd had enough to drink. "Apologies, sir." She bowed and disappeared into the busy tavern crowd. "Huh." He shook his wet hand and wiped it off on a handkerchief pulled from his robe. His loss of control irritated him even more than her persistence. His thirst had disappeared. As he looked around the room again, he realized so had his desire to remain in the tavern. He'd come to the tavern to think. He needed a change of atmosphere in a place he couldn't be found. Unlike the rest of the War Council, he rarely frequented the taverns and brothels in the city. He worked, trained, and spent time in his gardens. He pulled a coin and showed it to a passing barmaid. Once she'd seen it, he tossed the coin on the table and headed for the door. The slight buzz in his head reminded him again he'd had too much to drink, or breathe in too much of the smoke that wasn't all from the fire. He should have left long ago. He had an early day of training recruits tomorrow and then meetings. He picked his way carefully through the crowded tables and stepped outside with a sigh of relief. The air smelled like any large city, garbage, sewer, industry, and people, but compared to the stuffed, smoky tavern, it helped clear most of the buzzing from his head. The early morning hour meant once he walked far enough from the tavern, foot traffic vanished. It was located close to the main gate at the edge of the city. The location wasn't an accident. They had kept the rowdy customers and late-night revelers out of the more affluent areas, which kept complaints to a minimum. It also meant his long walk home would be quiet and solitary. He'd wasted the entire evening and achieved nothing. His thoughts continued to wander as he walked. During the last 1,000 years, the Empire had raided and stolen from every one of its neighbors constantly. Apart from its southern border that rested against the coast, it sat surrounded by 6 other nations. At over 3 times the size of the next largest nation, the Empire was easily the largest on the continent. Over the past couple of decades, the other nations had grown in technology, martial skills, and formed alliances with each other. The Empire no longer had a bunch of fractious neighbors. The older members of the council refused to acknowledge the significance of these changes. It had been years since any of them had been to the borders or seen any conflict aside from a pillow fight with a tavern whore. The Empire was struggling. Once the surrounding nations had stopped their individual squabbles, they found they could defend themselves from the Empire and still prosper. And prosper they did. The Imperial Wardens struggled to defend the borders from counter raids, and the regular Imperial troops provided no support. Their purpose was raiding, and the Wardens existed to defend the people. His frustration with the Council's blind stubbornness had no outlet. He kicked the loose stone angrily across the cobblestones. The motion changed his cadence of his step for just a moment. He stopped walking and listened while he bent down and pretended to adjust one of his sandals. Silence greeted him. Had he imagined it? He shouldn't have had so much to drink, but the heat and smoky air in the tavern had made him thirsty. It was part of the reason they kept the fire going year-round. It was stupid of me. He shook his head as he stood and continued toward his house. He kept his head down, still lost in thought, but paid more attention to his surroundings. His footsteps were the only sound echoing into the early morning. Despite this, his inner senses told him something wasn't right. The sound had bothered him. He'd heard something while kicking the stone. He listened for a repeat of the slight noise, but it didn't come. The more he thought about it, the surer he became. He glanced down the street as he turned a corner but saw nothing behind him. In spite of the light the street lamps provided, deep shadows hugged the buildings. He didn't have much further to go, but his gut told him something was coming. He took his next step normally, except just before his foot hit the ground, he held it from touching down while still letting the rest of his body move normally. The movement delayed his foot from touching for an extra second. There, the sound repeated. In the brief instant his foot should have hit the ground, a very faint sound of leather against stone carried to him. Someone very good at being quiet followed him. He needed to change things to his favor. He only knew that they were behind him somewhere, but not how far or even who. One person or two? More? He didn't know, and his current situation worked to their advantage. Halfway up the street was a narrow alley that would limit numbers and visibility. He continued moving naturally, unsure if the person following had caught on to what he'd done. He didn't change his steps or rush in case they hadn't noticed he was aware of them. The dark opening of the alley could have been mistaken for a hole in the building wall. None of the streetlights were close to the opening, leaving the depths of the alley pitch black. It was perfect. He casually turned down the alley, walked 5 steps, and stopped facing the entrance. Not wanting what little light that reached this far to reflect off metal, he kept his blades sheathed. He would kick himself later for not bringing his sword. He had a couple of daggers which he carried out of matter of habit. He was well known, and the council robes he wore literally screamed, "Don't mess with me." Why would he have to worry about being attacked in the capital? He twisted and threw himself to the side, barely avoiding the dart shape that fell from above. The attacker made almost no sound as they hit the ground next to him. Whoever this was, they were good. A foot lashed out, hit him in the chest, and sent him stumbling into the alley wall. He immediately spun away from the spot. The glint of steel passed inches from his face. Sparks flew into the darkness as the blade scraped along the brick wall. The sound was deafening. He pulled his daggers and skipped back toward the alley entrance to create some distance. One knife he held in a reverse grip, with the blade centered in his chest to protect his heart. The other he held point forward and low, just above his waist. His positioning with the entrance at his back was not ideal. The light silhouetted him and exposed his back to possible accomplices. His attacker gave him no time to think about improving his situation. They shot forward, a shadow in the darkness closing the gap quickly. A flurry of blows came at him. The low light made it hard to track his opponent and block everything. They only carried one blade to his 2, so he focused his defense on following that hand and the occasional sparkle of light off metal. A kick to his leg staggered him, opening his head up as he caught his balance. He pulled his front hand up to block the glint of steel he saw up high. Too late, he realized his mistake. He jerked to the side while raising his backhand slightly. The strike he'd expected up high instead came low from the other hand. It glanced off his own blade and slid across his chest, opening a burning cut from the center to his shoulder. His attacker knew he followed the reflected light from their blade and had used something else or switched hands. He had almost paid for the mistake. Another kick pulled his leg out from under him. He didn't fight it. Shoulder tucked, he fell to the side and rolled clear. He felt the air over his head stir as the blade passed where his head would have been. The sound of rapid footsteps chased him as he rolled clear. Taking a chance, he hurled one of his blades as he completed his first roll. The sound of steel on steel told him his throw had been accurate. The effort of blocking slowed the attacker, giving him room to regain his feet. The attacker now stood silhouetted in the alley's entrance. They charged him, but he was ready this time and moved with them to counter. The attacker stopped just short of engaging and shifted to the side. The move was supposed to draw him out and throw him off. He didn't take the bait. He turned with them, keeping his weight on his toes, and shifted back a half step to let the attacker know they would have to come to him. He still couldn't be certain if they had a second knife or had simply used something reflective to create the glint he'd seen. He didn't want to take the chance, so he waited. The brief moment his attacker had been silhouetted gave him a surprise. They were smaller than he expected, considering the power behind the few blows that landed. The slight frame would explain the soft nature of their footfalls. They were all black with some sort of mesh fabric to cover the eyes. He had to assume the fabric stopped reflected light and made it impossible to see where they were looking. The eyes said a lot about what a person was thinking during a fight. Without that to go on, he could only rely on the body, and a well-trained body could lie easily. The assassin lunged forward, feigning an attack, and shifted to the side, trying to get an angle on him. Instead of moving with him, he shifted the opposite direction, opening a space between them. The assassin had attacked fiercely and pressed him hard from the beginning. He got the impression they wanted to end this quickly. They rushed forward again, following almost the same pattern except their blade flicked out in a half-hearted attack. He slapped it away as he stepped opposite again. Grrr! Searing pain flooded through the hand holding his knife. He'd kept that hand centered over his chest to protect his heart. Had he chosen to block the knife strike with his own blade, whatever was sticking out of his arm now would be in his heart. He needed to end this just in case any of these blades were poisoned. Changing tactics, he rushed forward, leading with an empty hand attack towards their face. They countered with their own empty hand and lashed out with a thrust of their knife. He blocked it with his own while still pressing forward hard. The assassin rotated while stepping back, trying to get out of his path. He turned with them, throwing out multiple slashing attacks with his blade that crisscrossed his body. The sound of steel on steel rang out in earnest now. Ting, 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 accompanied by the slap of flesh on flesh as they traded punches at the same time. He pushed the pace faster and faster. His attacker was flagging, unable to keep up with the speed of the exchange. He could feel the desperation in their movements. The measured steps and turns became lunges and giant shifts of direction as they tried desperately to gain space and take back control of the fight. A leg lashed out with another kick, but he'd been waiting for the move. He switched his stance, pulling the targeted leg out of the way. The attacker's kick swept through unhindered, pulling them off balance. He struck with a straight kick of his own, catching them squarely in the hip and sending them flying. He lunged forward in a small jump, leading with his knee, and caught the attacker square in the chest as they tried to regain their footing. The hit sent them flying out of the alley and into the open street. The grunt of pain he heard was the first sound they'd made. Their movements said they were defeated. They just hadn't admitted it yet. He used the brief instant to pull the weapon, a small throwing dart, out of his forearm. You're about to die. Tell me who sent you, and I'll make it quick. He walked slowly from the alley as the attacker regained their feet. The slight wobble as they straightened told him his assessment was correct. They were done. No answer came, but their head turned slightly in one direction, then the other. You won't make it. If they wanted to run, he'd be faster. He was sure they knew that. He didn't receive a response, but the set of the shoulders and the stance told him everything he needed to know. This would be to the death. So be it. Resigned, the assassin attacked like a cage animal. They had nothing else to lose. Another thrown blade led the first attack, followed by a barrage of knife strikes from every angle imaginable. Desperation fueled their movements, and he was pressed hard to block or avoid every attack. He doesn't. Many small cuts laced his forearms, and one grazed his cheek, where he was too slow to deflect yet another thrown blade. The extent of his injuries was minor compared to what he had inflicted. He used the small dart pulled from his forearm to stab every time they crossed their larger blades. The attacker catches his knife hand with their free hand as they cross blades. The grip was slick with blood from all the cuts on both of their arms, but it's enough to hold him for a brief moment. The assassin thrusts a knee up between them. He twisted, taking the knee on the thigh, and brought his free hand up from underneath, stabbing quickly into the ribs twice with the small dart. It is the first lethal hit either of them has landed. He tried for a third strike, but the assassin turned their body and the dart gets stuck in a rib. His hand slick with blood, the smooth handle slipped from his grasp easily. He didn't need it anymore anyway. The weapon was small, but long enough he'd pierced the lung twice. The assassin bent sideways as they clutched their side and shrank away. "Who sent you?" "Last chance." The only answer he receives is a wet rattle as blood fills the lungs. They didn't have long. His attacker makes one last attempt and lunges forward clumsily with an overhand attack. He sidesteps and thrusts his knife up under the ribs into the heart. The body slumps to the ground, taking his knife with it. He was tired, and his hands were slick with blood. If they had had an accomplice, they would have intervened by now. Taking a moment to catch his breath, he stares down at the body. In the full light of the street lamps, the assassin is even smaller than he'd first thought. Had they sent a child after him? The better question, who trained this assassin? They had been good. He knelt next to the body and rolled it over. It weighed almost nothing. He pulled the mask off and fell back in disbelief. It was the woman from the tavern. Her ice blue eyes stared blankly up at the sky. A woman? It was unheard of in the Empire for a woman to fight. They ruled the home, but were not allowed to use more than a kitchen knife. A woman capable of fighting, especially like this one had, shook him. If he'd taken her up on her offer for another drink or some company. He let the thought hang as he considered the woman. Judging by her looks, she was most likely Anowin. He picked her hand up and felt it. He remembered the roughness of it from the brief touch in the tavern. Now it made sense. She had the calluses and scars associated with years of weapon training. This wasn't a one-off for her. He searched her body as respectfully as he could for any clues. He found a single sheet of bloody paper folded in a top pocket. There was nothing else. Unfolding the paper, he found a very good likeness of himself with his name, Commander Letok, written below it. He let his hands fall and stared at the woman. Another council member had gone missing a few days prior. Was it possible this happened? If the other nations had started using women as assassins, he thought about his own reaction to first seeing the assassin was a woman. The Empire was unprepared for such a thing. They didn't block foreigners, especially women, from entering the Empire. There could be hundreds of assassins lurking in the city right now, and the council would never suspect it. Of the 12 members, he was the only one that didn't partake in the brothels and rarely visited the taverns. The audacity of it made his mind numb. Would they even believe him if he brought this to them? He was the youngest, and his stiff nature hadn't won him any friends among the other 11 members. The Empire had been falling behind for years now. It wouldn't be long before they got overrun if things didn't change soon. Well, I guess we're going to be spending the evening together after all, huh? With a shake of his head, he stood and considered the woman again. He couldn't leave her like this. She'd been a good fighter and deserved the respect as such. Commander Letok bent down and carefully picked her up. Luckily, he wasn't far from home. Women fighting. Huh. The beginnings of an idea formed in his tired mind as he trudged home. An idea that would change the course of the Empire and one girl's life forever. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story. Any comments, leave below. Hopefully I'll have another one soon. Thank you.